ladies and gentlemen. We move to the final part of our journey this evening, and this part we've called Voyage of Discovery. How far can we go? Well, in the field of technology, business and innovation, no one better illustrates our theme than our next guest. For 20 years, he was a senior executive and director to one of the world's most innovative companies. Innovative in exploring new markets, in the diversity of its portfolio of products and services, and in exploring how far a brand can go. For 20 years, a special advisor to one of the world's most charismatic entrepreneurs, and himself the driving force behind one of the company's most adventurous business ventures. The company is Virgin, the entrepreneur was Richard Branson, and the man behind Virgin Galactic, our guest this evening. A warm round of applause for Will Whitehorn.
Good evening, Krakow. I apologise, first of all. I woke up this morning in England to find out that I'd lost my voice, which is never a good thing when you're coming to do a speech in Krakow that evening. So you're going to have to listen to a very croaky-voiced Will Whitehorn. I apologise. I'm going to talk to you today about a company that I worked for 25 years, what I learned at that company, and I'm going to say a little bit about what's happening in Britain at the moment in the world of innovation and business, and what Krakow can learn from London. First of all, let me start by saying something that many of you won't perceive when you go to London. I first arrived in London from Scotland in 1983, just before I started working for Virgin, the company that I joined. The company that I joined in 1985 only had 200 employees. Today, that company and a group of companies that operate under the Virgin brand employ about 60,000 people around the world, and it's become a worldwide brand phenomenon. That's happened over the space of 30 years or so. The London I went to in 1983 was a very depressed city. It still had a lot of bomb sites from the Second World War. Rioting had been taking place in places like Tottenham and Brixton, and it was not a place that was booming. The boom came later. When I first came to Krakow, it was about 20 years ago, and Krakow was not booming at that time, but it is today, and London is booming today. London has always been a super location for business, going back to the 18th century. Krakow was a super location for business at the time when the Silk Route came here, back in the 15th, 16th century. And I believe Krakow is regaining its place today as a super location for business, just as London has re-achieved over the last 30 years. So you, in the last 15 years, have moved this city forward immensely. And it is a great academic hub as well for education. There are as many students in the Krakow area at the various colleges and universities here as there are almost in the whole of London. So it is one of the great educational centres of Europe, and that will make it part of being a super location for doing business in the future. But let me move back to Virgin. I joined Virgin in 1985, but the company had started in 1970. And a young man who was 19 years old started it. It's almost a story of the resurgence of Britain. Britain in the early 1970s was riven by trade union disputes, the beginnings of high unemployment, an oil crisis. It was not a great place to be a businessman or start a business. And it was not a great place to be an entrepreneur in the 1970s. But a young entrepreneur called Richard Branson started a company called Virgin. Now, he said at the time, at the age of 19, that the reason he wanted to call the company Virgin, he said this in an interview with Vogue magazine, he said, the reason I want to call the company Virgin is I want to be able to do lots of different things for young people, and I want to start lots of businesses in the future. And Virgin's a sexy name, and you could put Virgin on the back tail fin of an aeroplane, you could put Virgin on the record cover, you could do lots of things with it. My cousin Simon Draper wanted to call it Slip Disc Records, but I said to Simon, we can't put Slip Disc as a name on the back of an aeroplane. So we've decided to call the company Virgin. Now that was a 19-year-old boy talking about a vision and a dream of a business. And this was the first ever Virgin logo you can see up on the screen there. And it was put on a record that came out 2 years later called Tubular Bells by a man called Mike Oldfield, which actually became the biggest selling recording album of the 1970s and became the theme music to a film called The Exorcist, which was the first of a new generation of horror films. It was an instrumental album, and it sold millions and millions of copies and made a very young man in the early 70s in Britain a millionaire. And the company then went on to change quite dramatically. And one of the reasons that it did change is that that young person had no fear of failure. He didn't fear the world outside, and he didn't fear trying something out and not getting it right. Now that was very rare in Britain in the 1970s. There was always a fear of bankruptcy and failure. Bankruptcy and failure in Britain were much more dimly viewed than they were in the United States, which had a much more entrepreneurial culture in the 1970s. But this young person didn't have one, mainly because he had a thing called attention deficit hyperactive disorder, which they call ADHD today. And you will know it sometimes as dyslexia. But he was a very hyperactive kid, and he did not fear failure. And so he decided he wanted to start lots of new businesses. In the late 70s, he was the entrepreneur in the music industry that discovered punk rock. He was the person that signed the Sex Pistols and Boy George and Culture Club. And he went on to build a whole range of businesses in everything from mobile telephony to the aviation and transport industries, right the way through to businesses in areas such as retailing. And Virgin grew and grew and grew. And when I joined the company, it was at the beginning of that growth phase. They had just started an airline. And I was working as a graduate trainee with Thomas Cook, the big travel company, learning the travel industry, when Virgin Atlantic, the airline, started flying. And I was inspired by the idea of this new airline because it was doing things differently. It was the first airline in the world to have seat-back television. It was the first airline in the world to introduce different classes of service. And it was one of the first airlines in the world to introduce new technology, which made onboard comfort much greater for the passengers. They designed their own seats, did a whole range of different things. And Virgin Atlantic doesn't fly to Poland. It's a long-haul airline. It flies long-haul routes out of London, but it's become one of Britain's premier airlines. Now, the interesting thing about Virgin Atlantic is it embraced a culture of innovation and quality at a very early stage. Sir Richard Branson, as he now is today, or Richard Branson, the young man who started it with a vision of doing it differently and doing what customers wanted on board and introducing things to make life easier for people when they were flying on long-haul routes. He was advised by a man who'd gone bust in the airline industry called Sir Freddie Laker, and Sir Freddie told him that the thing you have to do in business if you're going to make a business work is you have to combine quality, value for money, and innovate, always stay ahead of the competition. The airline industry in those days was dominated by big monopolies, such as British Airways, Air France, Pan Am, and TWA, and those monopolies had put the newer competitors out of business. And for Virgin not to go out of business, Richard took advice from this failed entrepreneur who told him that you must combine quality and value in everything you do, and you must innovate and always stay ahead of the competition. And Richard took those lessons very seriously and built a great airline out of Virgin. And he didn't see any problem with going from being a music industry mogul and developing punk rock and developing a record company called Virgin to having an airline called Virgin. He saw everything the Virgin brand did as long as it stood for good quality, value for money, as long as it did things with a sense of innovation and competitiveness, that people would think of Virgin as being a very competitive upstart company. They wouldn't think of it as being a company that did X or Y or Z. It was a very clever approach to branding for its time, because in those days most brands were related to products and not to ideas. One of the things that Virgin did as time went on was we developed lots of new businesses. And we realised we could go into industries that nobody else had been in before. In 1997, we went into the railway business, and we took over a defunct railway in Britain called the West Coast Main Line that ran all the main trains to Manchester, Liverpool and Glasgow. And it had been owned by the government since the Second World War. It was a state-owned railway. And we transformed it in a period of 15 years. We built a new type of train for it called the Pendolino, a tilting train. We introduced the world's first online ticketing system for trains. We introduced a whole series of innovations on board the train that had never happened before. And in 15 years, we doubled the size of the business. We went from 12 million people to 28 million people. By introducing innovation and quality and value for money, we doubled the size of a railway, something that hasn't happened in the rest of Europe in the last 15 years. So if you take the ideas of innovating and you take them forward in any business, the same parameters can work. What can work in an airline can work in a railway company. And that was one of the reasons that we decided that we could make it work in space. One of the things about Richard Branson as an entrepreneur is he thinks ahead. And I discovered when he decided that we should look at the space industry, he'd had a dinner with Buzz Aldrin, the famous Apollo astronaut. And when we decided that he wanted to look at the space industry seriously, he said, you better go and check the trademark for the brand. So I went to check the trademark for the brand to register it for space, and discovered that he had done it at the age of 24. Back in the 1970s, because he thought about one day wanting to launch a commercial space company, and he'd forgotten that he'd done it. That is the kind of character he is. And we decided that space was a big opportunity for our company, because we'd learned a lot about the aviation industry, and we'd learned a lot about the new technologies of aviation, and saw that they were not being applied in space. So we decided to go out and see if we could build a business plan to build a spaceship. And we realised when we were doing this, that in the 1960s, the Americans had actually built a space plane called the X-15, and they'd flown into space 200 times. But because it wasn't capable of getting to the moon, the project had been abandoned when President Kennedy made it a priority to beat the Soviet Union and get to the moon before the Russians. So this project had been abandoned, and eventually it became a stealth fighter. But it had actually been a space plane, and it was very economically efficient. We then found out, if you look at the top picture there, that a man called Bert Rutan was building a spaceship in order to win a prize of $10 million called the X Prize. And we realised that he was building it out of new technology materials called carbon composites. And that this was going to be such a cheap system that it could safely, potentially, get lots of people and science and even satellites into space at 1/10 of the cost of using a big, expensive rocket from the ground. So I was given permission by Virgin to go ahead and start building a spaceship. It was a fascinating project, and we eventually built what you see below. It's called Spaceship 2. It can hold 6 people with 2 pilots. It can take them into a suborbital flight to 100 miles above the Earth. It can also take up space scientists and science, and it can also launch unmanned satellites. And we built a business plan around what people wanted from a spaceship. We found out that space tourists, people who might pay money to go there, and there are now 1,000 of them signed up, and the company holds $100 million of their deposits. The space tourists, the thing they wanted most was to experience weightlessness. We found out space scientists, if they were going to go up and do suborbital experiments, needed space and peace and quiet. So if we built a big enough spaceship for space tourists to move around in and experience weightlessness, we could also use it for science. And if we built a big enough spaceship for that, we could build an unmanned version to take satellites to space for $2 million instead of $200 million. The spaceship got built, it began test flying. It actually had an accident last October. There was an accident when one of the pilots, through pilot error, caused the spaceship to crash. But the second one is now nearly finished. It's beginning test flying again this summer. And by next year, this system will be carrying people and payload into space. Now for me, it was a very interesting journey to build a space company, having got experience of building innovative companies in Virgin and transportation, because we didn't have any idea of what had gone before us. There'd never been a space company. All space had been done by governments beforehand. So we needed a new home for this spaceship. So we built that in New Mexico. And this was the last project that I worked on for Virgin before I left in 2010. The spaceship was finished in 2012 and began testing, and the spaceport was opened in New Mexico in 2012, and I worked on the building of that. Now, one of the interesting things that taught me was that you can actually do almost anything if you really put your mind to it. If you don't fear risk and you learn to manage the risk, both in your life and in what you do, and you have a good plan behind what you want to achieve, and you do proper research, there shouldn't be a limitation on what you can achieve. We managed to build this spaceport in New Mexico with the cooperation of the state of New Mexico and build the spaceship system and test it for less than $500 million. Now, $500 million is the cost of one single space shuttle flight back in the 1970s. By the time the shuttle was shut down 2 years ago, it was costing $2 billion per flight to take the shuttle into space. We had built an entire system for $500 million. And one of the ways we achieved it was by keeping the team very small that built the spaceship. 46 of us did the project. We employed a lot of outsourced contractors who worked on the project with us, Scaled Composites in particular, a company in the Mojave Desert, and a number of other contractors on the rocket motor. And the 46 of us in the team worked to a series of rules that had been developed in the 1940s called Kelly's Rules. If ever you're doing a project in IT or working on any project, they're worth looking up. The 14 Kelly's Rules were the rules that were set in 1946 to develop a company called Skunk Works for Lockheed Martin to do advanced aviation projects. But I found that they applied to this project very well. If you're doing special project management, it's good to follow these kind of precepts. Now, since I left Virgin, I've gone on to do a couple of other things. One of the things I'm doing is a very big project in Scotland. And I took the design of the spaceport in New Mexico. And one of the things we've done in the roof of the new spaceport in New Mexico is designed with a geodesic new technology design. And we realised that the spaceport roof, because it needed no pillars to support it, because of this design of it, done by an architect at a company called Foster's in London, we could take that design and apply it to an entertainment venue. So basically, we took the spaceport roof design and we applied it to a venue in Scotland called the SSE Hydro in Glasgow, which opened last year. This has been the latest project I've been working on. And that 12,000-seat arena, based on the design of the spaceport, has now caused the revitalisation of the centre of Glasgow. It's become the second busiest indoor rock and pop arena in the world, overtaking Madison Square Gardens. Because it's built with new technology materials, the furthest away the audience is from the artist, even although there's 12,000 people in the audience, is nearer than the nearest seat at the O2 in London. So you can see the artist far better. There are no pillars to interrupt you in this Colosseum-type auditorium. And again, taking the ideas of researching what people wanted in Glasgow, how big a venue you could build, what could you do to the design of it, and by applying all those to a business plan, we've created a new profitable business in central Glasgow, which has caused the revitalisation of the centre of that city. So innovation projects can come from one area and can be applied to another, even though you would never believe that a spaceport in New Mexico could end up being the basis of a design for an entertainment venue in Glasgow, Scotland. And that is the venue right in the heart of Glasgow that opened last year in time for the Commonwealth Games. Now, one of the most important lessons to learn from all the things that happen in business is that there are no limits to what you can achieve. If you think with an open mind, and most entrepreneurs are very open minds because many entrepreneurs are quite hyperactive people, and they think about things in a very linear way, and they extrapolate their thoughts outwards. If you could apply that to everything you do, it's amazing how the ideas can just trip along. And then behind those ideas and those dreams, you put process, you build a plan, and then out of that can come growth and success. Virgin has achieved what it's achieved over 35 years, growing from 200 people and a young entrepreneur aged 20 to an entrepreneur still running at aged 65 with 60,000 people by not fearing risk, but learning to manage risk, take risk and understand it. And if we all take a bit of managed risk, we can do amazing things. Thank you for your time.